Man, I had some garlic bread earlier and it tore the hell out of the roof of my mouth. So, was Final Fantasy XVI a success? Well, kinda depends upon your definition of success. Square Enix recently had a earnings release, and they stated that 16 didn't meet the high end of expectations, but that it did meet expectations. So it basically did as well as they thought it was going to, realistically. Now, if you've been around the internet game for a little bit here, you'll know that sometimes Square Enix defines success as a bit extremely, right? Sometimes games that'll sell millions of copies, they'll say it wasn't a success because it didn't meet some absolutely unrealistic level of success. But Final Fantasy XVI has sold millions of copies already, while still being a PlayStation 5 exclusive, and I think it's a good as time as any, now that I've beaten the game, to talk about the success of Final Fantasy XVI. Because in my opinion, it's one of the best games in the franchise, for a few reasons that I talked about in my earlier review. But look, massive departures from established formulas will always be polarizing amongst player bases and fan bases. That's always going to be the case, and Final Fantasy XVI was, is, and will be no exception to that rule. But in my opinion, if you're going to try and establish a new formula or shake up the existing formula to some degree, you better dang well knock it out of the park, and I think they did that here with 16. So if by success we're talking about if the game is good, I would say it's a rousing success. Absolutely rousing. Because it's a phenomenal game to me, and one that will probably end up being my game of the year. That's how much I enjoyed the game. The story, the world, the music, the side quests, the boss fights, everything. It's well constructed, in my opinion. But there's a few aspects to Final Fantasy XVI that will impact its sales figures. Number one, this isn't a game rated T for teens. It's not. It's rated M for mature. To some people that may not mean that much, to me it's something I welcomed, and I love the mature themes and aspects that they tackled and showed in Final Fantasy XVI. I thought they were all handled very well. But it will impact sales for some people. And there's also another aspect we have to consider, and that's the fact that the Final Fantasy XVI game is a PlayStation 5 exclusive. And I've talked about this since before release, and I agreed with voices that echoed similar sentiments. That do not expect 16 to sell as well as Final Fantasy VII Remake or Final Fantasy 15. Just don't expect it to happen because those games released either multi-platform or on platforms that, while they were exclusive, had a more of an install base to sell to players. Final Fantasy VII Remake was a PlayStation 4 exclusive, but the PS4 had sold more at that time, if I recall correctly. And Final Fantasy 15 may be a very controversial game, and criticized game, in my opinion, and just overall, for a variety of factors, but it's also multi-platform, that continue to get additional ports. Final Fantasy XVI is only on the PlayStation 5 right now, and due to a bunch of economic reasons and scarcity due to supply shortages, the PlayStation 5 numbers and install base is still growing. It's not where the PS4 was for Final Fantasy VII Remake, or where the Xbox One and PS4 was, or were, for Final Fantasy 15. So there's an argument that you can make, right? And I think it's a good one. That as the PS5 continues to sell, because it will, as it continues to sell, more and more people will probably pick up Final Fantasy XVI. And then even more people will pick it up when it gets ported to PC at some point. Now there's some talk and dialogue going around that somehow Final Fantasy XVI absolutely crashed the Square Enix share price. It's a bit more nuanced than that. Look, I'm not an economic expert here, but Square Enix does release their earnings reports, or earnings releases, and there is one for August 4th for the 3-month period that ended on June 30th, and I'll leave a link to that in the description down below because it comes right from Square Enix, right? There's no middle person trying to put their own spin on things. This is just Square Enix, so you can read it in their words and see their sales figures. if you want to look at it for yourself. I'll leave that in the description down below. But I think putting all the blame on Final Fantasy 16 would just be misconstruing the reality of the situation. Because Square Enix is a big company. They do manga, they do a bunch of other non-Final Fantasy games, they publish games, they even have a mobile scene. All those factors together, that's how you get that drop in share price. That, from the VGC, again, link in the description down below, is a near 15%, which you don't want to see coming off the back of a major release. But again, if they expected Final Fantasy 16 to sell like 10 million copies within the first week or month, they were high, pretty much. And I don't think they expected that to be the case either. They said that Final Fantasy 16 hit their expectations, which makes sense to me. Less numbers than 7 Remake or 15, but still, when you compare that, it's still doing fairly well, considering the smaller install base of the PlayStation 5. And if they're able to maintain word of mouth because of the inherent qualities of the game, keep that going for the PC release, get a potentially a big push for that, have a well-optimized, fluid, silky smooth, like a pig's butt, don't ask, launch for Final Fantasy 16 on PC, that can get conversation going again. That can push even more people who don't have access to a PS5 to play Final Fantasy 16. Because the inherent qualities of Final Fantasy 16 aren't just its story, in my opinion. Its gameplay loop is very satisfying, and that will appeal to certain people. Now, I know they said they have, like, what was it, like an 18-month plan for Final Fantasy 16 to help, like, boost sales or something? You gotta imagine at some point in that, it's the PC release and maybe a DLC if they can get one out before. Realistically speaking, right, I don't know how much the DLC would help sales numbers. I imagine they would help a bit, but just to keep Final Fantasy 16 in public discourse, get some sales going for the game as well, and then you're probably rocking. Now, I think it is possible that at some point in the future we may get an Xbox version for Final Fantasy 16. I don't know what the exclusivity contract for 16 was, but judging from the Final Fantasy XIV Fan Fest, where they seemingly reaffirmed that going forward into the future, there will be Final Fantasy games on Xbox with Phil Spencer, even on stage with Yoshi P and the Square Enix CEO, I think it's safe to say going forward, they probably want Final Fantasy to be a multi-platform series, and I support that decision in my opinion. I think if their main goal was to have Final Fantasy XVI sell as many copies as humanly possible, you wouldn't have made it an exclusive for just the PS5. Especially coming off the bat of the phenomenon that was Final Fantasy XV. Where even despite the fact that game was flawed in many ways, it sold so well. Like 5 million or something in just the first day. And for a Final Fantasy title, that is extremely good. I love Final Fantasy. I love Final Fantasy 16. I want the game to be available to as many people as possible. I don't buy into the whole console wars BS rhetoric that kind of perpetuates and infests online gaming discourse. I despise that conversation. I'm pro-consumer. And in my opinion, games going multi-platform when they can is pro-consumer because then you as the consumer can choose where you want to play your games. Or to be able to play the game in the first place if you only have one console. And I think either way, a lot of the times, especially with stuff like TikTok and Twitter, I guess X, discourse at this point, a lot of conversations that surrounds these popular games coming out each year revolves around the game's inherent popularity, and that's somehow being a justifier for your enjoyment of the game. Like, I get it. It's kind of treating games like they're sports teams. And sure, it can be fun to engage in that conversation every now and then. I'm not saying don't have fun, right? What I am saying, though, is even if Final Fantasy XVI ended up not selling well, and you love the game, be proud of that. Be proud that you were able to have an experience that was positive, that meant something to you, whether it's emotional or in terms of enjoyability, that other people weren't able to. And likewise, if someone else enjoys a game that I don't like, I wish I could enjoy it as much as they did. Why would I actively root to have a bad time with a game? Square Enix has made a lot of decisions in the last few years that are kind of baffling when it comes to marketing for certain games, or propping up certain games, or not marketing other games as much as they probably should have. You know, games like Octopath 2, Bravely Default 2. There's a lot of games where it seems like you could have marketed this in a way better way to potentially give these series and these games the kick in the proverbial butt that they need. And there was some rumors going about. I don't know how reliable these are, so don't take them on as like gospel or anything. Take them with a massive mountain of salt, that Square Enix may be pivoting away and leaning more into AAA releases instead of having a bunch of AA releases, which kind of makes sense if you look at that financial report I talked about earlier, by the way. Again, link in the description. And I'll read a little blurb from it. It's on page 6 of the PDF, but it's labeled as page 4 on the document. And it's talking about mobile games here, but you can kind of extrapolate this information. Meanwhile, a familiar list of titles continues to dominate the upper end of the smart device game rankings in Japan, and the entrance of Asian players into the Japanese market has intensified competition, reducing the odds of new titles succeeding. Given the intense competition in both the consumer and smart device game markets, it will be important for the group not only to leverage existing intellectual properties, but also to endeavor to create new intellectual properties and to recruit development resources if it is to continue to produce hits, by developing content in keeping with these environmental changes and diversifying its earnings opportunities. The group is endeavoring to establish a robust earnings base. I think in the next few years we're going to see Square Enix really lean into the mobile market. And going off of what they said there, it sounds like they want to make new IP alongside that to also sell for mobile games. So I'm expecting them to go all in with their heavy hitters and try and come up with some new ones. I think Final Fantasy XVI overall will continue to sell. It's a good game. It's an amazing game. And word of mouth will matter for this game. If they're able to knock the PC port out of the park, then that could be another boost. And if the DLC can come out and is hype, and the game gets some good sales along the way, then there you go. Sure, Final Fantasy XVI is a controversial release for Final Fantasy, but it's of high quality, and that's a far better position to be in than if the game had a bunch of pacing issues, was glitchy, or was just overall unfinished. That's not the case with 16. I think 16's biggest issue was that it didn't have access to big enough of an install base. So in my eyes, was the game a success? I would say yes, because I think it's a very good game that'll almost certainly end up as my game of the year. Will it end up as a financial success for Square Enix? Depends upon how they want to define that. So I'm gonna call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. Yeah, my voice is starting to go, so I'll call the video there. Thank you all for tuning in. Stay safe, have a great day, go play some video games if you can, and as always, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye, everybody, until we meet again.